Have a look at any scene featuring a car park in a James Bond movie from the 2000s. You'll probably notice an abundance of Range Rovers, Jaguars, Volvos, Lincolns, maybe even a few Fords sprinkled in there, not to mention the main hero himself driving an Aston Martin. This is called a product placement, and behind this one was a $37 million deal done between the Bond producers and Ford's CEO Jacques Nasser himself. But $37 million was nothing for Mr. Nasser because assembling all of these brands under Ford's umbrella in the first place cost the company an estimated $17 billion. All for an ambition to conquer the world's luxury car market with the Premier Automotive Group. Indeed, this lineup was eventually supposed to be even larger. But 20 years later, all that remains under Ford are Lincoln and layoffs. And when trying to look anything up about PAG or PHE, you're more likely to find yourself on the homepage of some random car dealership from Wisconsin instead. So what the hell happened? The 80s were a time of pure excess and unmitigated luxury. It's only appropriate then that during the decade, the big three American manufacturers went on a spending spree, either investing in or buying up entirely small, specialist European luxury brands. This was a direct answer to the oncoming threat of imported luxury cars from BMW, Mercedes, and even the up-and-coming Audi, as Ford, Chrysler, and GM had nothing to compete with these car makers on a global scale. Yes, Lincoln, Chrysler, and Cadillac were all luxury brands, but beyond the American market, they were essentially non-existent. GM got a hold of Lotus. A year later, Chrysler acquired Lamborghini, and as spearheaded by Walter Hayes of their European division, Ford bought Aston Martin, a struggling company that was very much strapped for cash and waiting for someone to come and save them. Well, that could be said for all three actually, but whatever.
For Ford, it is an opportunity to enter the high-image specialty market, where Aston Martin has earned an outstanding reputation.
Was Ford's line of thought here, but a specialty manufacturer wasn't gonna bring in all the riches that Ford was truly looking for, so they kept searching and eventually landed into talks with two more European companies, Saab and Jaguar. But Ford wasn't alone. GM was also going after the same two companies and had even held meetings with Jaguar before Ford entered the picture. Eventually, Ford gave up on Saab and went all in on Jaguar, saying that it could not justify Saab's asking price of about $1 billion. Still, however, the executives from Jaguar preferred the bid from GM as they wanted to guarantee Jaguar's status as an independent company. The General's proposed purchase fell short of being a complete takeover. Ford's didn't. This was the big cat's game, until the British government stepped in and declared that they were willing to lift a certain state restriction that could be used to bar another company from owning more than 15% of Jaguar. On their part, General Motors eventually backed out of bidding on the company, as the $2.5 billion valuation of the British firm was too much for them. But the men from the Blue Oval took that deal, and Jaguar was now theirs. Ford appointed one of their own guys, Bill Hayden, as the new head of Jaguar. He went down to see what the company had been working on before the takeover, took one look at the prototype, said he was going to have an orgasm, and then declared that Jaguar's quality wasn't bad, it was horrendous. Nevertheless, Ford now had two British luxury brands under their umbrella, both now getting an injection of much-needed cash. This was especially necessary as there was a little recession in the early 1990s, and by '94, Jaguar was losing about £1 million every day. But undeterred, Ford was now truly laying its groundwork for a lineup of European luxury cars that would dominate in Europe, in America, and across the world. And this was a good time for the company to go through with this very expensive venture. In 1993, 5 of the 10 best-selling cars in the US were Fords, and just 4 years later, the company reported a record $6.9 billion in profits. Surely a lot of this success had to do with Alex Trotman, Ford's CEO, and his Ford 2000 initiative, a big consolidation effort to reduce costs and unify Ford's offerings across all their markets. But perhaps just as important as the CEO was the new vice president, Jacques Nasser. Nasser had been with the company since the late 60s and had truly climbed the corporate ladder to being the head of Ford's automotive operations by 1996, where he continued his policy of killing off unprofitable vehicles and shifting production around. He earned the nickname Jack the Knife for a reason. Around this time, it was Nasser who began floating around the idea of creating a unified group of luxury brands owned by Ford. It was his vision that the company should be pushed up market. But hey, he was just the number 2. What was there that he could really do? On that date, Alex Trotman announces that he's retiring, and by January 1st, Jacques Nasser is the new CEO of Ford, with William Clay Ford Jr. taking on the mantle of executive chairman. That same month, Ford pays $6.45 billion to buy Volvo. With this, Nasser's goal and plan of overtaking General Motors and becoming the world's biggest car company is set in motion. The Premier Automotive Group was formally established in 1999, initially encompassing Aston Martin, Jaguar, Volvo, and Lincoln. To head this department, Nasser brought in Wolfgang Reitzel, a man who he had immense respect for and had specifically sought out. Reitzel had just left BMW, where he had insisted that the German company should get rid of Rover once and for all, but landed on deaf ears. So he quit. At the newly formed PHE, things were looking brilliant. Ford's acquisition of Volvo happened just as Volvo had spent millions on developing the S60, V70 and S80, 3 very important new models that would allow Volvo to essentially coast along for several years. Aston's DB7 had quickly become the company's best-selling model of all time, with more than 7,000 being produced by the end of its run. Mind you, before the DB7 came along, Aston Martin had produced fewer than 10,000 cars during the company's entire lifetime. Meanwhile, Jaguar was heralding its new Jag generation, as they called it, with models like the S-Type and X-Type, the latter of which eventually lent its platform to the Lincoln LS, intended to be a serious competitor to European sports sedans. In 1998, Lincoln outsold Cadillac for the first time in nearly 60 years. Clearly, prosperity was the one word that could describe Ford at this moment in time. So why stop at just these 4 brands? Shortly after joining PHE, Reitzel made an offer of about 200 million Deutschmarks to Alpina to become the performance division for Jaguar, akin to Mercedes' AMG and BMW's M divisions. The talks with Alpina didn't yield any results, but perhaps things would go differently once Ford tried snatching up their biggest acquisition yet: BMW. Speculation that Ford was going to make an offer became so rampant that the company eventually had to make a statement.
We do not comment on such speculation.
At the time, BMW was losing money hand over fist with its Rover investment. As such, it was under the watchful eye of multiple companies looking for a possible opportunity to try and take BMW over. Seeing the writing on the wall, the Germans eventually decided to call it quits and give up on Rover, putting its assets up for sale, including Land Rover. 2 giants immediately jumped at the opportunity to grab the off-road mark: GM and Ford. Of course, it's those 2 again. Ford won out and caught Land Rover for an easy $2.7 billion. So with this final round of acquisitions done, the Premier Automotive Group was set. Aston Martin, Jaguar, Volvo, Lincoln and Land Rover. Ford was finally, once and for all, ready to take on the luxury market and win. Against a backdrop of falling sales in Europe and a decision to go ahead with a massive recall of 13 million tires, Ford's shareholders and Bill Ford pushed Chuck Nasser into resigning as CEO. His replacement would be Bill Ford himself, and it's hard to come up with a reason why you'd want to be in his shoes during this time. When the Premier Automotive Group was launched and Ford was doing very well, the company claimed numerous times that Ford's future growth and profits depended on PHE. Well, under Nasser's leadership, Ford suddenly wasn't doing very well. In 2001 alone, the company experienced $5.5 billion in losses. More to the point, they'd spent more than $17 billion rounding up all of these brands under the PAG umbrella, but they were not getting $17 billion back from their investments. Seemingly as soon as he gained the top position, Bill Ford started floating the idea that Aston Martin should be sold off, as it was his belief that Ford should be focusing on their core models, meaning Ford models. Still, for now, Aston remained in the hands of PHE. All the excitement that seemingly surrounded the S-Type and X-Type seemingly disappeared. The X-Type got stuck with the common belief that it was just a Ford Mondeo in a fancy dress, despite sharing less than 20% of its parts with the Mondeo. But that kind of connotation just sticks around forever.
Underneath, the X-Type is actually a Ford Mondeo.
On its part, the S-Type was wrong. Just as they tried banking on nostalgia for old Jaguars with its styling, the luxury car segment was quickly moving into the future, and fast. The 2001 BMW 7 Series shocked with its highly controversial styling, and then promptly became the best-selling 7 Series up until that point. Meanwhile, Audi continued their innovations with aluminium body design, and Mercedes was doing just fine. Also, the S-Type was very ugly. To remedy this, they had a look at the front fascia and then decided to change the rear end instead. Ford made Volvos more expensive and then expected more sales. That's not how anything works, unfortunately. And under Ford's leadership, Volvo actually lost market share and eventually became less profitable than it had been as an independent company. Yes, Lincoln had beaten Cadillac in sales numbers for a few years there, but as soon as things became great, they became worse again. By May of 2002, Lincoln's numbers had dropped by 23% compared to the year prior. With that, the decision was made and Lincoln would, quite literally, physically move back to being under Ford's direct control, as Lincoln's headquarters would move from PAG's Irvine head offices in California back to Dearborn, Michigan, and the era of Lincoln sharing platforms with Jaguars was over. Despite all new products being launched, including the L322 Range Rover, which Ford essentially got for free as it had been developed under BMW's ownership, Land Rover was selling fewer cars than it had been prior to Ford's buyout. While sales may have been up in places like the UK, American sales were lagging, and as Wolfgang Reitzel said,
"Strong growth in North America is key to the long-term success of the group's marques."
Let's go back to Reitzel for a moment there because... No. Just a few months after Nasser's departure, Reitzel followed suit and would be replaced with Mark Fields. The two men who had spearheaded and fought for the Premier Automotive Group were gone. So now what? In under a year, both Ford and PHE had come under new management, and no matter what they tried, Jaguar could not eke out a profit. The new boss, Mark Fields, made a decision to merge Jaguar and Land Rover, essentially making them a single company. Aston Martin was originally also intended to merge with them, leaving Volvo to do things on their own, but that didn't happen. To organize their design activities, Volvo designer Peter Horbury was brought in to oversee all four brands. Perhaps now, with even more cost-cutting and new management brought in, things would finally start coming up roses for the Premier Automotive Group. 2006 was said to be Ford's worst year in history, with a total loss amounting to $12.7 billion. Oh, and they had a new CEO, Alan Mulally, who was now tasked with turning this around. He took some incredibly brave actions to secure a large hoard of money for the company essentially, including mortgaging many of its assets like the Mustang name and the blue oval logo itself. And you know. Keeping the Premier Automotive Group alive wasn't sustainable. It hadn't been before and it certainly wasn't now. While it could be argued that the first domino to fall was Lincoln's removal from the group just 3 years after it was founded, 2007 truly became the year where the Premier Automotive Group began to die. Aston Martin is sold off to David Richards, the motor racing boss, for $925 million. Then Jaguar Land Rover gets sold to the Tata Group in a deal worth $2.3 billion. Meanwhile, Ford is denying the unfounded rumors that they're also trying to offload Volvo. In a Christmas miracle, Ford confirms that Volvo is to be sold off to Geely for $1.8 billion. If you need a reminder how much they paid for Volvo back in 1999, it was $6.45 billion. The Premier Automotive Group was a failure. In terms of sales, in terms of profits, in terms of brand image. When asked about the Jaguar X-Type in 2009, Jaguar executive Mike O'Driscoll said,
Do we still make it?
Yeah. But you have to find a bit of good in everything, and so I'll try. Aston Martin was the one brand that did brilliantly well under Ford's ownership, and Volvo's XC60 did something that no other car could. Increase its sales year over year, even hitting its best year of sales the very same year it was replaced by a new model.
Join the Corsicar membership program on YouTube today and receive exclusive content and the right to brag for decades to come. Tell your family, tell your friends, and join the Corsicar membership program on YouTube together to support your 57th favorite content creator. Just keep in mind, these cheap prices will last forever.